Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Florence Honore from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm delighted to organize and moderate this session on team specialization and its implications for funding teams. So as Johnny said, this is part of the entrepreneurship and strategy interest group. This is actually my last activity as a rep at large, but Danny is taking over and we'll organize a similar session with Toby Stewart in the spring. So stay tuned. But let's focus on today's session. I'm really happy to welcome Evan Rowley, who's the Eversource Energy Scholar in Technological Entrepreneurship and Associate Professor in the Management Department at the University of Connecticut. So Evan's work encompasses diversification, agglomeration, but also more recent work on individuals' incentives and teams, including today's topics on team specializations and coordination. So Evan, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction and for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you for attending. I'm going to share my screen. And away we'll go. Okay, so Danny and Florence asked me to talk about something to do with entrepreneurship and something broader than just a single paper. And so I thought what I would do is talk about teams and some work I've been doing recently, but not just one paper I've done, but just kind of the idea about where this research came from and what I think could be done in this space going forward. So this is joint work with these two wonderful co-authors I have. I don't know why Kenny is moving. That's interesting. Kenny Ching and Enrico Forti. Kenny's at Worcester Polytechnic and Enrico is at Manhattan College. They are brilliant people and wonderful co-authors. And a lot of what I am saying today that sounds intelligent has come from them. And all the mistakes will be my own. So okay, so we started talking about one of my favorite topics, Enrico and I, at a talk I was giving in London. We started talking about one of my favorite topics, which is, back to the Coasian question of why firms work, in the sense of why are firms better than markets in some sense, or maybe the more strategic version of that question is why are some firms better than others? What makes firms heterogeneous and what makes them good. And there's a lot of great answers to those questions. Something could have to do with competitive dynamics, or could have something to do with, why do firms fail, the agency costs, something like that. But what has always fascinated me is how we can make firms better by improving the internal organization of the firm. And so there's a whole class of answers about how you improve the internal organization of the firm. But a lot of them start with this basic idea of what is the firm in the first place. And there's some descriptive ways of thinking about what is the firm. It's a nexus of contracts, it's a nexus of routines, but there's also some more prescriptive ways of understanding the firm, like, for example, transactions from Williamson's transaction costs, where we have some sense of here's how we could endogenously improve the performance of the firm by changing the internal organization of the firm. And along those lines, I think one area that we as strategy scholars haven't taken as much advantage of as we should is thinking about the firm as a nexus of teams. Because I think when you consider the firm as a nexus of teams, you start to have some interesting prescriptive implications. And that's really nice for theory to endogenize where these advantages come from. And it poses an empirical challenge, but there's always ways to get around empirical challenges. So I think increasingly in organizations, work is done by teams. The most important work is done by teams. Often these are cross-functional temporary teams making strategic decisions, or project teams addressing some high impact issue for the firm, R&D teams, new product development teams. And there's a lot of interesting stuff happening within the firm that makes them heterogeneous or have a competitive advantage, that's related to the organization of the team. So, we think about firms and markets as being alternatives as a starting point for strategic analysis. I think including teams in the mix of how we analyze the firm is a very useful starting point. So that's the starting point for what I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of what makes teams more productive, I said there's a lot of different ideas out there. There's a whole class of research on incentives, mechanism design, you've got to get the incentives right. That's obviously of tremendous importance. I'm just going to leave that aside for now, in part because of what I was just saying on the last page. A lot of what's happening now in the workforce is that teams are put together without explicit incentives for the team. Or if it's something explicit, it's not so easily quantifiable in the end. And so I think, when we think about, for example, I was a consultant for many years. When you think about, say, a consulting team or a legal team, there's somebody who's sort of nominally leading the team, but a lot of the interaction that goes on within the team is like peer-to-peer interaction, where you just have to cooperate independent of some explicit incentive over you. Of course, there'll be a performance evaluation, and your promotion depends on things like that. But I think about environments where incentives are not the most important factor, because I think that's where we as management scholars can really have a big impact on thinking about how to make teams more productive. And that comes to organizational design. Okay, and so we have ideas like, it's something about routinization, so that people can just show up at work and know what to do. They don't have to check in with the manager all the time. I think that's a very useful way of thinking about organizational design. But what I've been personally quite interested in over time are elements of organizational design that are again more prescriptive, something that's more endogenous, something that you could see the firm really managing quite explicitly. And so two candidates, there are, I'm sure, many others, but two candidates that strike me as particularly fruitful for exploring are specialization and shared experience. Okay, so we kind of know that specialization is good, but there's more to it than that. And we sort of think shared experience is good, but there's more to it than that. And so I want to go into those concepts to see if we can come up with some ideas for how to improve team productivity, how to improve organizational productivity, how to improve entrepreneurial team performance. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first one, with specialization. So smart people have said, coordination problems are at the heart of the enterprise. For example, Garicano, in a nice 2000 paper, said, organizations exist to a large extent to solve coordination problems. And that really makes a lot of sense to me when I think about what firms are trying to accomplish and what they struggle with. It's, a lot of times as people they're trying to make stuff work, but they're busy, and it's not always that clear what you're supposed to do. And so, there are incentive problems as well. You can have these coordination problems. Now, in the literature on specialization, in general, what people have found is that it's better to be specialized. You go back to Adam Smith talking about, why one nation can be wealthier than another. He talks a lot about specialization and says that specialization is enabled by the extent of the market. In other words, if you've got a big market, you can have people do very, very narrow things, but they can do it very, very well. And because the market is big, they'll have enough liquidity, enough workflow that they can specialize in a narrower and narrower way and become an expert at this one little thing. And then the economy will churn out great little pieces, and we'll put it all together, and we'll be really rich. In that context, and that way of thinking about the world, specialization is exogenous. Okay, it just has to do with agglomeration, essentially. But Becker and Murphy in 92 had a really interesting sort of follow-on and rejoinder to that idea, saying, yeah, the division of labor is great, but somebody has to coordinate all those specialists. So they're kind of getting at this like Coasian market versus hierarchy duality in the world, saying like, okay, the market is coordinating the specialists in the world where, everything is a market and firms are irrelevant. But if we start thinking that firms are doing something that markets can't do, they've got to organize the specialists somehow too. So they've got the internal organization of the firm to manage, and that's a crucial challenge for them. As Garicano says, it's to the large extent the whole reason the organization exists is that they can solve some coordination problem that markets can't do. And so, Becker and Murphy talk a little bit about like, oh, maybe that's the generalist. Okay, so the generalists, they kind of know what all the other specialists are doing, and so they're the manager and they run the show. And that's, I think, an interesting kind of starting point for thinking about what firms are doing and why specialization matters, why we might care about coordination, and why we might care about experience, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. Okay, so what I really like about that view, that Becker-Murphy view, is that they've endogenized coordination. They said, like, this is something the firm can control. So we've got, let's call it human resource strategy or corporate strategy, right? Or if you're the founder, you think about, the founding team, the strategy for creating the founding team. What are we going to try to do? Well, we're going to try to maximize specialists or specialization while minimizing coordination costs. So we really don't want generalists, but if we need one, we're going to have one, but we want as little as we can. But in order to do that, we're going to have to minimize coordination costs. And that has this nice flavor of something like a Klepper 1996 innovation lifecycle concept, which is just the idea that, the competitive advantage of the firm can be endogenous. In fact, the endogenous part is the part we care about. This is the part that we can influence. I will see a lot of papers that have some interesting results that come across my desk as an editor. I see, some very nice data, some very interesting context, but a lot of times the theory just sort of assumes that there's some exogenous endowment. Oh, they're really good at this, and that's their resource. Okay, I mean, that's something. But what I'd really like to know more is, how can we affect this thing? How can we create competitive advantage? And so this Becker-Murphy idea that maybe we can improve coordination by somehow figuring out how to get the balance right between specialists and generalists strikes me as a very appealing one. Now, another endogenous organizational design element that I think is quite appealing is the idea that organizations improve with experience. There's a lot of papers on this. Arrow has a famous one. Hatch and Mowry have a very nice paper. This graph here is from Peter Thompson. It's not exactly showing improvement with experience because the horizontal axis is time, but there was a lot of accumulated experience going on over that period of time. So it's a good proxy in this context for accumulated experience. And what it's showing is the total number of labor hours per ship declined quite substantially from the beginning of World War II to the end of World War II at the port of Oakland when we were making the Liberty ships, which are transport ships for the war in the Pacific. And there was a few different models. That's why there's a few different lines. But basically the idea is you get better at the thing because you work together and you kind of figure it out. Okay. And that can be a source of competitive advantage if there's a learning curve and you get ahead and there's some time compression diseconomies like in Dietrichs and Kuhl. That can be a great source of competitive advantage. So that's another one that's in there. That's another potential source of competitive advantage. And if you think about it, it really has a lot to do with teams, although learning by doing started off as a literature that was focusing on individual learning, like in the classic paper by Wright in 1936. He notices workers get better at doing their job the more they do it, which is a very sensible and intuitive concept. But what's really happening that's, in an important economic sense with learning by doing is really happening at the team level. As that Thompson chart I showed you on the last slide demonstrated, a lot of what we're talking about, accumulated experience, is accumulated learning in a team, accumulated experience in a team. They're putting together these Liberty ships in a group. They have to think about which sub-assembly should be made first and where should the welder stand when the engineer has to be part of some action. So it's about coordinating the actions of people within a team to improve your productivity. And there's been some very nice papers on that, including some that I talked about on the last page. But some of the ones that call this out explicitly have been more recent. So like Huckman has some nice papers, and that's just one of many. There's a bunch of very nice papers. Huckman's paper I really like, talking about teams of physicians. That's with Brad Stats, and showing that they get better the more they work together. They implicitly coordinate more effectively, and they call that, to sort of distinguish learning by doing in teams from learning by doing as an individual, they call it familiarity, which I think is kind of has a nice evocative sense to it. So I'm going to pick up that use and use familiarity in this discussion as well. That's learning by doing in teams. Okay. And it's something about, we figure out how to coordinate together. Okay. So we're back to coordination, and we're back to endogenous competitive advantage. Okay. So how does familiarity actually help the team coordinate better at a more, refined level? Okay, yes, it helps us figure it out, but there's been some really excellent theoretical work and empirical work as well on the subject. And I want to call attention to a couple of ideas that I think are really crucial. One is this idea from Lewis and co-authors in 2005 about transactive memory system. When I first heard this concept, I was like, is this ESP? What's going on? This doesn't sound very credible to me. But when you read the paper, actually, it's quite insightful. And the idea is you learn about who knows what in a group. So you think about Huckman's surgeons. They know who's going to handle some particular aspect of the surgery. They don't have to discuss it at great length. They can just go in and do the surgery. And when time is of the essence, you can see that would be very, very important. Betschke said it a little bit differently. I think in a way that actually was more intuitive to me, was that you get some insight into the other's preferences, styles, and idiosyncrasies. So you see what people do, you see what they like, you see how they behave, you think what's different about them from others, and you're learning something by interacting with them that you wouldn't learn from reading a report about how they behave, or having worked with somebody else. This person's different. So that's kind of one idea, is that shared collaborative experience improves your sort of ability to implicitly coordinate, because you understand each other. It's like a cognitive sense, either joint cognition or individual cognition about a dyad. So the opposite in is dyad, and that gives you some ability to improve coordination. The other big idea that I see is trust. Okay, and so the idea with trust is that you've got some belief about your teammates' future behavior. Either it's you have trust in their motive, you can see they're a good person, they're going to try to do the right thing, or you have trust in their ability. You might not think they're a great person, but you can see they're really good at doing that surgery. And so trust is another element that influences how familiarity improves coordination. And this is sort of operating in the background of the theory that I'm going to try to describe to you, and maybe I'll pull out some of these elements and talk about them more. But that's sort of the underpinnings of why team coordination is improved by familiarity. Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. Another piece is I want to think about in actually taking this to a more testable theory. I want to think about how types of experience influence coordination costs. So clearly, this kind of plain vanilla experience, shared experience, matters. Okay, like think about Thompson. We do the thing a lot together. We get better. There's a million papers on this. They're, some of them are very, very good, and the theory makes a lot of sense. And so we know that matters. But in terms of pushing on this idea more so that we can get into endogenous sources of competitive advantage, I think there's just a lot more that we can unpack with thinking about experience and coordination costs. For example, we could think of how the characteristics of the agents might matter. Okay, so like say the people have different backgrounds. Does that influence how you develop your experience together? You can think of all kinds of different backgrounds, educational or gender or something. Like there's a million characteristics of your background, or it could be experiential background characteristics, like the kind I'm going to talk about today, with different degree of specialization. So getting back to Becker and Murphy and Adam Smith, we'll think about specialization as being a characteristic of an agent. And we'll say, hey, maybe that affects how shared experience is manifest in the production function of the team. Or maybe it's the characteristics of experience matter. So it might be that, like, there's a bunch of nice papers on how succeeding or failing affects you differently. So that's one where it's like a very obvious characteristic of the experience might matter. Or what I want to talk about today is maybe experience competing gives you useful insight into your current teammate as opposed to cooperating. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how I think characteristics of agents or characteristics of experience might influence coordination costs within firms and therefore endogenous sources of competitive advantage. But I think there's just so many others, and I think people haven't explored this as much. In part, just speaking from our discipline and strategy, this has been more like, oh, that's an OB topic, and but really, to me, it's at the heart of strategy and entrepreneurship as well. But also, I think there just hasn't been the data. So people probably have a lot of ideas about how characteristics of agents and experience matter, probably a lot of good ideas, but there just hasn't been such good data for until quite recently. And so now we're starting to get much more data on the micro characteristics of firms, of teams. And so we can do much more. We can test these theories much more, which I think makes it a nice time to be exploring these ideas. Okay, so here's what we have a couple papers that one is published in Org Science and one is forthcoming, and we have a bunch of other ideas we're working on, but I'm just going to talk about the two that we're sort of the most done with, the one that's published and the one that's forthcoming, and tell you about our theory there and show you some of the evidence, and then try to link it back to why this is an interesting idea for others as well. So it seems like what people have found in studying familiarity in the past is that it lowers the cost of coordination. Okay, I think that's, at least what seems to me, that's what people are saying in the literature. Well, Becker and Murphy say if you can lower coordination costs, you can get more specialization, because now you don't need that generalist to be the translator. That's kind of what the generalist is doing, is translating for the specialist. Oh, I'm the expert in accounting, and this is the expert in marketing. They can't understand each other. The accountant is always trying to cut the budget. The marketing person is always trying to spend more. And so, the strategy person comes in, they're the generalists, and they get these people to talk and figure out where the trade-offs are. Okay, well, maybe you don't need that as much if these people have worked together a lot before, because they don't need that translation. They understand each other better. Or if it's a time-sensitive kind of issue, maybe the duties and responsibilities are well understood. You're on the fly, like in Huckman's surgery example. Maybe it's not so much translation, but it's just we understand what one another are going to do very, very quickly and very readily. So maybe that's another reason why. But anyway, it seems like people have said familiarity lowers coordination costs. That indicates to me that we should get more specialization. Okay, so that's one part of that's one theory. We have more than that, but that's, I think, the most interesting part of one of our papers. Another part is going to have to do with competitive familiarity, as I was saying before. So that's working with a former rival. You've had exposure to them in the past, but that exposure is from competing, not necessarily through cooperating. And I think we see this a lot in the world. Like, this has been on my mind for a long time, actually. Ever since I first started as a consultant, my first consulting job was with Deloitte and Touche, and the way that they ran the new training for all the new hires was they had this big case competition, and you all competed to win this prize, and that was sort of like the core of the training. There was other bits too, but that was like the core of it. Then when I went to BCG after business school, their new consultant orientation was all about like team building. Oh, we'll build a pyramid and run with a spoon on a cup, and it was sort of like, oh, it's like we have fun and we get to know each other that way. And so I've always sort of wondered, like, which is better, the more competitive environment or the more cooperative environment? And since I had 2 data points, I have no idea, but I thought, maybe the Deloitte one had something to it. I felt this kind of intensity of the experience seemed to bond people together in a way that maybe didn't so much with other activities. But like I say, very, very small sample size. But it struck me again. I was watching one of my kids play soccer one time. He was on some kind of, team that was thrown together by a random person. And I saw him make a no-look pass to another kid. And so after the game, I was like, that's a pretty bold move to just make a no-look pass to somebody you've never played with before. And he said, oh, I played against him, so I knew he was going to run over there. And I was like, huh, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of like competitiveness. You learn something. So that's been in the back of my mind for a long time. And I've seen it in the literature too. People have talked about there's rival project teams at Haier and Tencent and Samsung, where different teams compete to achieve some objective. And then once they get the sort of prototype off the ground, they join together and they develop it further as a group. And that's also, you see that with cybersecurity a lot. There's like red team and blue teams where you divide the organization, and the red team tries to break into the system and the blue team tries to defend it. And then, we all get back together again and work together. So I think we see this a lot in organizations. Certainly, there's a famous book about Team of Rivals, about how this happens in political organizations with Lincoln's cabinet. And you see it in hackathons, where people have these kind of prize-based engineering tournaments where they work in teams against each other at one stage, and then they reformulate the teams and work together at other stages. You see it at startups, when startups are formed by members from rival organizations. And so, you see it in M&A when you acquire your competitors. I think you see this a lot where you've competed against a former rival. Now, I'm going to show you a setting where the competition is very in your face. It's the central part of the empirical context, because it's a game, so like with a sports team, it's obviously quite clear that you compete with people that you then could collaborate with. But I think we see it outside of these gaming contexts as well, maybe to a lesser degree, but it's still there. So I think competitive familiarity is kind of another nice area to explore. And so competitive familiarity, I'm going to call what Huckman and others have called familiarity, or what sometimes is called social familiarity. I'm going to call it cooperative familiarity here, just to distinguish it from competitive familiarity, but to have a nice alliteration. People say that arises from repeated cooperative interactions, facilitates coordination. Well, maybe competitive familiarity should too, because you have these same kind of exposures to people. You see what they're doing, and you understand them. But maybe it gives you something unique as well, a different perspective. Maybe something about that intensity or the salience of the competition should create different pathways for team learning. Okay, so I'm thinking of it as more of a complement to cooperative familiarity. So the context I'm going to talk about is esports, where we test these ideas. To be honest, the main reason we tested them here is because we've got exogenous assignment of players to teams. And so that allows us to study endogenous elements of organizational design that otherwise we'd just be left with observational data for. So that's sort of the main reason this context is interesting, but it's got some other nice things about it too, which is that some of the elements are observable. Let's see. 14 minutes. I think I have time to show you this 1-minute clip that will give you some sense of how I felt about thinking about esports as an empirical context for research when I first was exposed to it by Enrico. Okay, so this is from Saturday Night Live when Chance the Rapper was on there. They send the character as a reporter to study a League of Legends tournament. We're going to study Dota 2 in our context, but it's very similar to League of Legends. And how perplexed this gentleman is when he gets there, sort of reminds me of myself. Okay, so I'll just show you like a minute of this.
Wait, and when we see the slide, we don't see the video.
What? Did I hear somebody say something?
Yes, I see your slide. I don't see the video.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I have to go to maybe the new share. I appreciate that. Okay. I'm a little out of practice from my Zooming days. My goodness. Okay. All right. Can you see it now?
Yes. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So let me just show you.
Signing off. Now, hold on, Laz. I'm sure you have thoughts on Team Echo's.
Anyway, when I first saw this, I was like, what the heck is going on with this game? But what you can see from that is it's actually quite a very complicated game. It's played by 5 players simultaneously on 2 different teams. And it's got, this incredible dynamic to it that's like you couldn't script your behavior. So it actually makes a very nice context too, because people in other research like Beth Batchke have shown that when you can when the specialists can sort of operate in what they call a plug and play mode, where they each have such well-defined tasks, they don't really need a lot of explicit coordination, because all the coordination comes from the implicit division of labor. Okay, and so go back to my slides. So you don't have to look at my face too much. And so it's a nice context for thinking about sort of teams that really need a lot of coordination. Some kind of implicit coordination from their experiences together. So it's a nice context too, because you might think if you're going to find it anywhere, this is a context where coordination is going to matter a lot, and therefore you might think that some kind of joint knowledge of one another from having worked together in the past or worked against each other in the past might be valuable. But the main thing is this exogenous assignment, okay? And we have this sampling strategy. The number of people who played this game is way too large for us to analyze them all, but we have a nice sampling strategy that comes from social networks, where we just take a subset of the players. We take all the players who ever played in a professional match. So this is a big business, tens of millions of dollars a year in prize money, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. These players are like rock stars. They travel with an entourage, and they have managers and diet, exercise, they have groupies. I mean, it's a whole thing. But we're just going to take the people who played in the professional matches, which are the only matches where teams are endogenous. Okay, and then there's a whole bunch of matches, millions of matches, where the teams are exogenously assigned. And those matches are important because that's how the people who want to be professionals get noticed. And so you have people taking these exogenously assigned games very, very seriously, so that they can one day get into the world where they can actually make money by doing this. And so we just sample on the people who have ever at least once played in a professional tournament. We look at every single game they've ever played in, including all these people that we don't know everything about, but we treat them as if we know about them from just the matches we're looking at, which is a valid sampling strategy from social networks. And then we can make some inferences, statistical inferences, about how specialization and experience influences outcomes. So we're going to run a regression. The dependent variable is a win or loss, whether they win the match or lose. These games they're organized by the game maker such that people are sorted into a tier that is appropriate for them. So they have like a score, like a chess rating, they call it MMR. And they have tiers of your MMR, and you get sorted in there based on your ranking. And then within that tier, the teams are randomized. So it's not completely random what team you're on, because it does have tiers, but it's exogenous assignment within the tier. Okay, so we're going to look at the team's performance, given that someone's just been dropped in, and we're going to define people as specialists if they usually take one of the roles in the game. The game, defines these 2 roles broadly: carry and support. If you usually play carry, you're one kind of player. If you usually play support, you're another kind of player. That makes you specialized. If you play that 75% of the time, we say, and then we play with that threshold up and down. But any sort of reasonable definition you come up with of who's specialized generates the same, roughly the same kind of results. And then we call a team specialized if they have 3 specialists on it. Now that's another number we play with. Call it 4, call it 2. You get roughly the same result. There's not that many teams with 3 specialists already. So, we are looking at a set of data that's meaningful, but not a huge chunk of the data. Okay, so that's where the team is specialist. Then we look at cooperative, or sometimes it's called social familiarity, which is based on the count of the number of times teammates have played together, and competitive familiarity is going to be the count of the number of times they played against each other. Those are the key measures. Everything's going to be in logs or standardized so you can interpret it. And we're going to exploit this exogenous assignment of players to teams. So the matchmaking algorithm in most of the matches, basically all the matches in our test sample are going to be exogenous assignment, but we include the endogenous matches for creating the measures. So all the measures are properly calculated, but then we just look at the matches where there's exogenous assignment. And it's supposed to have like a 50-50 chance of winning. There's one team that's randomly assigned goes first, the other team goes second. And so you'll see there's actually not a 50-50 probability of victory. We always choose the first moving team as the team we study. We include the competitive team in the data as well, but we call that the opponent characteristics. Okay, so we've got a nice causality. Here's I was telling you victory is 52% because we always choose the team that moves first. But still, it's really, it's ex ante 50-50 probability of winning before you're assigned to your team, and then you're randomly assigned to a team. And so this is pretty much like flipping a coin. Anything you can do to move the probability of victory is going to be really important. You'll see competitive familiarity is not very common compared to cooperative familiarity. You're wondering, how can cooperative familiarity, how can you be assigned to somebody 29 times? Well, remember, we're including in the measure the endogenous games too, like the tournament games in the measures, not in the test sample, but in the measures. So there's teams that play together, and the people play together 3,966 times, in fact. And same kind of thing for competitive familiarity. You're put into these in these tournaments. There's only so many players that can make it in the tournament, so you're more likely to be exposed to these kinds of players, and within the tiers as well. So you still do play against people more often than you would think if it was truly random. 8% of teams are specialists. We also have a generalist team. 8% are those, and then there's some other stuff here that we measure and do in our robustness checks, but I won't get into here. So I know we only have 4 minutes, but I'm going to finish. Okay. So so first thing we see is this bottom bold and italics effect. Specialist teams up here. Specialist teams are better than generalist teams, like you might expect. This is, it's better if the people can do one thing really, really well. But specialist teams that have a lot of cooperative familiarity, okay, those are the ones that do the best. So in other words, it's a complement to being a specialist. It's a substitute for being a generalist, having this cooperative familiarity. And so that allows you to win more often because it enables specialization. Okay, kind of like the idea that Becker and Murphy were talking about in theory. We actually find some hard evidence for this by using familiarity, as a coordination cost reducing mechanism. So I think that's kind of a cool result. We have a bunch of other things too that helps with other kinds of familiarity too, but I think this or other kinds of team characteristics as well, but I think this is the main one of interest. In terms of competitive familiarity, we find column 3 is the main specification. If you enter competitive familiarity, you also allow opponent competitive familiarity. You'll see that's just the opposite sign, about the same magnitude. And you compare that to cooperative familiarity. In this context, it's a huge effect relative to cooperative familiarity. You get a 5% effect if you double your competitive familiarity compared to a 1% effect if you double cooperative familiarity. Now, some of that is because you don't have a lot of competitive familiarity and there's huge marginal returns at the beginning. Okay, but even if we adjust for all these things, you still end up with cooperative familiarity having a larger effect than competitive familiarity having a larger effect than cooperative familiarity. And maybe that has something to do with the context of the game. It's, you can really observe your competitors directly, and there's not a lot of incentive conflict. There's really no incentive conflict. There's really no reason to be emotionally angry at somebody who beat you. They're not physically harming you. So, maybe in this context, it's kind of stacked in the favor of finding competitive familiarity. But it's striking that it's quite such a large effect. And I think it's at least a proof of concept that competitive familiarity does matter. And it is complementary as well, as I was sort of arguing for. It's something unique. These are just plotting the coefficients. Competitive familiarity is bigger than cooperative familiarity, even with the interaction term, but the interaction term is still meaningful. Okay. So implications. I have 2 more slides. So implications. I think one implication for us as scholars is we can go beyond these basic experience effects. Okay. And I think, as I've shown here, by considering other organizational design elements in concert with experience effects, I think that's a really fruitful way forward for us. For managers, I think it's really, it's a great opportunity for them to think about ways that you can exploit teammates' relationships to one another to help improve team performance, not just, getting the best people in the door, but also managing them, coordinating them in the best way. And it's particularly important for entrepreneurial teams, okay, where the team is everything. It's not literally true, of course, there has to be an idea, but the team is of great importance. And if you think about a world like Klepper's world, where there's endogenous innovation based on some heterogeneity and initial conditions, this could be the initial condition that gives you the advantage that allows you to magnify that competitive advantage over time and over experience. So the conclusions quickly. There's more to specialist teams than plug and play. Bechke makes a nice case that plug and play is a model that can work for organizational design, but there's more to it than plug and play, as Becker and Murphy sort of suggested in their theory paper. And here we come with some evidence that yes, indeed, if you know your teammates, it improves coordination, especially amongst specialists. I should just say amongst, but especially amongst specialists. And then shared experience, I think, is a rich concept that we can unpack a lot further. There's been a lot on shared experience. But hey, what about competitive experience? What about different types of shared experience? Okay, and so we find that it improves team performance, at least in this particular context. Okay, so sorry if I went a minute over. So that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Evan. Okay, so it's time for questions. So you have different options. You can write down your questions. You can also probably raise your hand, and I can unmute people who want to directly ask the questions. And no, actually my video is off. But maybe let me start with a question. So when you talk about the concept of familiarity, does that mean that they keep learning about each other, but that they can also make sense of things that didn't work out so well for the team? Because I can imagine that's where you still need a manager or a coach, let's say in the case of sports teams, that maybe you have to make sense of the feedback loop they get from performance and adjust the team. Or do you think maybe it's self-sufficient in the familiarity kind of concept?
I love it. I love the question because you have two more papers in that question that you asked right there. So one is does hierarchy matter? What would these effects be like if you had hierarchy? The teams that we're looking at empirically don't really have, we can't observe the hierarchy. Probably they do have some hierarchy, but we can't observe the hierarchy. And so that would be very interesting. Is the key person the manager? Is that the key person who's making sense of everything? Are they still the generalist? Does it matter if they're a specialist? All that stuff about hierarchy is really important. And I can't say anything about that here. I mean, I can tell you what I think, which is that I think the boss is sort of the natural focal point for interpretation for the team. But how that exactly plays out, I don't know. The other thing you're asking about is, yeah, you notice what went well, but don't you also notice what didn't go well? And I'm sure they do. And we didn't really distinguish between those two kinds of experiences in this paper, but as I alluded to, there is a large literature on learning from success versus learning from failure. And that's something that we are actually actively talking about and exploring is, when do you learn more from winning and when do you learn more from losing? So I don't know, but stay tuned or work on it yourself or invite me to work on it with you.
Thank you. Wait, I see Danny. Danny, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
But Peter also had a very similar follow-up question to your question too.
Go ahead. Oh yeah, I see the Q&A now. Okay, Peter, let me find you and unmute you. Okay, no. Okay, Peter, you can talk.
Oh yeah, hi. Great presentation, Evan. Thank you. My question was similar to the one that Florence just asked, thinking maybe about hierarchy, but more specifically about a context like yours in which it seems like, there has to be close coordination among the team members to get the outcome desired, like, the no-look pass in your soccer example. But yeah, there are a lot of things that we consider teams. Like, think about ourselves, right? Think about a department of university professors in which we mostly operate autonomously or independently. We enjoy some shared resources, admin support, equipment. we do require coordination on curricula, but on the research side, we're in a geographically localized team, but our research collaborations may be, typically are across boundaries. So it seems like in the first kind of a case, or your team of surgeons would be another example, you need some direction, some coordinating mechanism, either a strong boss, like Florence was saying, or maybe, norms or culture or something. Whereas in the latter case, you could have like a really decentralized setup and individual performance performance incentives. We call that a team, but it seems very different from the kind of teams that you're talking about. So I guess the question is, what's the role of interdependence versus modularity among tasks or individuals to make your story kind of play out?
That's a great question. Yeah, we talk a lot about modularization and stuff like that in the paper, because you're absolutely right. And this isn't going to be it's not going to matter so much to organizations where, as Bechke calls it, where there's plug and play, where you've got your well-defined role and you do it and you don't have to coordinate that much with somebody else, or maybe you have to coordinate with them, but you know exactly what they're going to do because it's scripted in advance. And so in those kinds of contexts, will it still matter? I mean, sure, it could matter a little bit, but it's not going to be 5 times the effect of, well, I don't know, maybe cooperative familiarity won't matter either. So maybe familiarity, doesn't matter at all in that context. So maybe you have to be in a world where, coordination, implicit coordination has to matter. I think that's probably absolutely right. So I'm not going to claim that this applies to every single team, but
I'm just wondering, but do you think that familiarity and hierarchy might be substitutes, or do you think they're complements?
No, I mean, they could be. I mean, it probably depends on the context, right? But absolutely could be that if you have the boss. I mean, I think that's actually what Becker and Murphy are kind of, well, actually more to the point, that's kind of what Garicano has in mind in his paper. It's like the boss is the master specialist, and then there's this triaging system where the lower down people, if they can't solve the problem, it kicks it up. And so in that world, the boss is coordinating by being the expert of last resort. And what the people down low have to know how to do is where to put that problem. And so, yeah, I mean, you can set up hierarchy so that it can be a substitute for familiarity, or you could probably set up hierarchy so there could be a complement to familiarity. I don't think there's going to be one answer to that, but I think it definitely is another way of thinking about improving coordination. And that's one reason I was saying I'm kind of interested in these more decentralized project teams, because I think that's where this probably has the biggest effect. So anyway, thanks. That was a great question.
Thank you, Evan. Okay, I think Danny, you can ask your question.
Okay. So Evan, I thought this was a really intriguing result on specialization and increased performance. And, given the theme here on entrepreneurship and strategy, I would love to get your thoughts on how and whether we can actually apply these insights on the context of early stage startups. So this is similar to Peter and Florence's question. In a context where we have a lot of uncertainty, maybe we have formal hierarchy, the founders as bosses, and maybe in a context where the goal is perhaps not as explicit, so there's a lot of search, a lot of exploration. Do you see specialization operating the same way? Perhaps not. And relatedly, are there different kinds of outcomes where specialization would be helpful versus not?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think in contexts like startup teams where there's a lot of search, I think that this kind of implicit coordination effect is even more important, because you don't know exactly what you're going to be doing tomorrow. It's going to depend on what happened today or, in 5 minutes. And so when there's more uncertainty in the future, I think that's when the team has to work in this non-hierarchical way more effectively. Yes, you have the founder, but the founder can't do everything. The founder's got to just provide the vision and hire the people and hope that they're good, to some extent. And so I think it's actually really crucial for startup teams to have this. And I think that's if you think about like a project team where this has more obvious bite as opposed to like what Peter was saying for us in our kind of more siloed world, you think about a project team, that's like a startup team. You bring these people together, they don't have a lot of commonality before that, and you press play. Well, maybe it's better if they have some relationship before, and maybe it's better if they've even competed against each other before. So I think I like this as a way for a founding team to get that initial competitive advantage that they need to build off of.
Thank you. So next we have a question from Meow Meow, looking into the future. Could you ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. I want to know more about like the future of like team, because like I imagine it could be like a hybrid of AI agents and humans. And I wonder how might the integration of AI in human teams influence the dynamics of like specialization, coordination, and how do you think like the theory could apply to the future of like a hybrid team structure? Thank you.
That's really interesting. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think AI is it's interesting because AI is really, it's just an algorithm that's based on what's come before. So I could see AI actually being like a way of exploiting experience more effectively. You have, if there's a pattern in the data, AI is going to be better at finding it than a person potentially. And so, that's really interesting. Maybe, AI could be a great way to exploit shared experience. But I think the problem with AI is it's sort of, over determining what the answer is going to be based on the past. And if something changes in the future, the AI is not going to be any good at recognizing that unless the change was buried in the past. And so I think that's what humans are better at. And having some shared experience might allow them to adapt faster, understand it better, maybe adapt the AI model better. I don't know. I mean, if it's a perfect AI model, it's going to adapt as soon as the change happens, but it still might not be predictive of the future. So maybe that's the role of the humans, is in anticipating the future. But I mean, that's just a fantastic question that I'm not going to be able to answer very satisfactorily. Sorry.
Okay, so Thomas has a question. Let me unmute him quickly here. Okay, how long to talk? Okay, so Thomas, you should be able to talk now.
Okay, thank you. So very interesting presentation, Evan. Can you share your thoughts on what are the key trade-offs that a firm that wants to foster productivity via specializing team space? Especially, are there any trade-offs that negative consequence for employees or even at the firm level, let's say bilateral commitment, reduction, easy of movement towards other firms? So what are the negative consequences? And do you see any type of firm that is more or less subject to the negative consequences? Thank you.
That's a good question. I mean, just from my own experience, like consulting is a context where you start off as a generalist, and then in order to be effective, in order to be a partner, you really have to specialize. You have to become like a professional consultant, basically, getting the bills paid, and specializing within an industry. And so how do they get people to make that specific investment in the firm, at least, if not to the profession? It's to have some kind of incentive, a partnership, where you become a residual claimant. And so you're right that when you have co-specialization, at least at the firm level, you need some kind of arrangement where where people, you can commit to not expropriate people ex ante, or you can commit ex ante so that you won't expropriate them ex post. And so I think that that does affect firm specific specialization. If it's just specialization in a activity, where there's a market for that, then maybe it's not so important. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or just randomly ruminating, but I think that's one way I've been thinking about the negative consequences of specializations and how you might deal with it. But just to be clear, I mean, I'm not trying to say that specialization is always the best. A lot of people have found that usually it is. What I'm trying to show is that familiarity improves specialization. And so it helps people who are specialists who otherwise might have trouble coordinating their activity. It helps them coordinate because now they understand each other better. So I think that's maybe a little bit more straightforward.
Thank you. So we're almost at the end. Let's see if one more questions come to the chat. Otherwise, I had another question. So I think in the eSport, I mean, first I should say the cool finding is that opponent familiarity that you find, like that's really positive and helpful. But I believe in eSport, they probably watch a lot of each other's previous games. I suppose it's recorded. And I think in some fields, like we read each other's paper, firms, read each other's patents. So I almost wonder if, so basically competitor intelligence, like really matter. Like you need to be able to understand that. And people who plan or try to plan their careers might also try to understand competitor much more. Like, do you have any comments on that, or have you thought of other fields where we might also find that opponent familiarity, like strong positive effect? Or maybe sometimes it could even be not that great. I don't know if there will be context where it might be deceptive. I don't know.
I think you again make two great points. Really, one is the importance of, say, competitive familiarity is going to vary a lot by context. Right. I mean, there's going to be some contexts where you just can't observe the competitor that well, or what you learn about them doesn't help you very much, so there's definitely going to be a lot of heterogeneity by context. I just looked at one context. So, it seems to me that there's some where it seems more important than others. But, I would hope others would study it and then tell us more about that. But the second thing you said that I think was also really nice was your point about competitive intelligence. I think, firms often aren't that good competitor intelligence. They're so busy working on their own stuff internally, but there's a lot of benefits from it. And one that you might not have expected is, hey, by understanding your competitors better, maybe you'll be able to cooperate with them in the past. Now, I said something like that somewhere and somebody said, oh, that's just game theory. I was like, well, okay, maybe that's a fair way of thinking about this. This feeds into game theory as well. But I'm really talking more about at the team level more than at the firm level. I'm really saying you'll be more productive working with somebody. I'm not going to dispute that competitor analysis is valuable, but I don't think that's exactly what I'm finding in this research. So.
Thank you so much, Evan. I think we're at the end of our time here.
Thank you so much.
I hope you all enjoyed it. And as I said, there will be another session in the spring. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, guys.